Also welcome to this interview. I'm happy also to have you here. It's also for me an honor to have this interview and get your impression on a nice part of science, electron diffraction in particular. But I also wanted to touch on crystal engineering. You being a major promoter of it. Which techniques you feel are most important to understand and manipulate intermolecular interactions in order then again to design materials with specific properties?
Yes, crystal engineering now encompasses a very wide body of subjects. Hard to imagine that this was simply in the thoughts of people, say 30, 40 years ago. And now so many people have come to this, I call it an umbrella discipline, which in the broadest sense looks at structures and how to use these structures, design them to make things that are useful in some way or the other. So when you talk about techniques to look at structure, I would broadly divide them into three categories: diffraction based, which implies some periodicity somewhere in that structure. And then there is the whole spectroscopic branch, again, where one can look at interactions and structures. And finally, I would call the computational branch, where you can examine the interactions in ways that sometimes is different or complementary with diffraction and spectroscopy. So I think people today in crystal engineering have become quite eclectic, You have groups which are, equally adept in more than one of these techniques. So people are not scared anymore to use these things together. And in fact, I believe, Eric, you must, because these interactions are both complex and subtle. And very small tweaking in the interactions can make big differences in the structures that can be designed and engineered. So it amplifies quite a bit in some cases. So I think it's important that one gets a very precise understanding of these interactions in many cases. Yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned computational methods. Artificial intelligence seems to be an area coming up. You have a feeling it's mature, or it's approaching maturation, or it's still?
No, it's nowhere near maturation, but it is a technique with immense potential in the future.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
simply because it is based on analysis and digestion of very large amounts of data, and it combines what shall I say, a knowledge-based thing with some new innovations and so on. So I have the most positive feelings about the way, and in fact we do see, even in the crystal engineering area, for especially crystal structure prediction, you see this artificial intelligence thing. It's already the subject of regular papers in the subject.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. And then you mentioned diffraction, of course, probably as the first technology.
First.
What made crystallography so fascinating to you when in your early days probably encountered crystallography?
I think just the romance of it. I think many people let's say in my age group and my generation, I was of the age when we rapidly graduated from the handheld four-circle diffractometers, which largely worked manually, to suddenly the computer-controlled diffractometer. And So within a period of a year and a half as a graduate student at the University of Illinois, I graduated from punching paper cards to suddenly seeing the data on a big magnetic tape.
Yeah.
And the kind of shortening in time that we observed was amazing. But at the end of it, I'm reminded about, the famous quotation from Goethe about crystallography, which is so well known that it fascinates many of the most intelligent people. And of course, people like to forget the second part of his quotation where he said something about, it is amazing that a subject as useless as this attracts so many intelligent people. But the question of crystallography attracting people is definitely, it's part of the romance. I mean, you take a small thing like a crystal and then suddenly you start seeing atoms and stuff. And, suddenly the whole thing comes to life. I mean to say, I don't know how else to express it. And I think the basic beauty of, the diffraction itself and going from Fonlave to Bragg and suddenly saying that from the diffraction pattern you can get an image, and then the beauty of the phase problem itself. The fact that with amplitudes alone you can get the phases of reflections. This is something that is very, very counterintuitive. I think even established crystallographers in the 1940s say, wouldn't believe that with amplitudes alone you could get phases. And yet there you are. I mean, so I think crystallography has been a diffraction full of surprises. And that's why I think it's not just me, but I think people in every generation have been attracted to this subject for reasons that cannot be totally, I think, verbalized. And,
Yeah, quite right. Yeah, I also experienced when solving a structure, it used to be a bit of a struggle, but it still was quite a nice surprise or a little wonder to get your structure on the screen.
That's right.
Yeah, but also the aesthetic part. I suppose you also made Weissenberg and
yes,
photographs.
Especially doing a Weissenberg upper level on a triclinic crystal. Hey, that was fun. It's very hard to explain to students nowadays. It's some kind of almost like a masochism to to analyze. And then of course, our lab was lucky in those days in Illinois that we also had precession cameras. So we had both Weissenberg and precession. And I think although the precession geometry is more difficult to understand, I think in terms of interpretation of the first photographs, I think it is the precision that taught me to appreciate the Weissenberg, which is maybe not true for most people.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
But I think now we're talking in a language which most people today may not be able to understand.
But yeah, we're talking challenges in the former days. There are still challenges around in nowadays in performing crystallographic experiments in general, given the sample or the method or whatever. And nanocrystalline samples could be a challenge nowadays. But do you see other big challenges in performing crystallographic experiments now today?
With electron diffraction, not so many. But I mean, yes, the thing is that the question of samples not crystallizing has been a major challenge for people in, say, crystal engineering. Because you can have any kind of sophisticated design idea and, put a molecule down on paper and try to start crystallizing it and not get crystals that are suitable for X-ray diffraction, either because they are not big enough or, they're not big enough because for some reason the nucleation is too fast. And there is no easy way to control the speed of nucleation. And I have come across some papers and I've enjoyed discussions with certain people as to whether by just looking at the molecular formula, you can estimate if crystallization is going to be difficult. And this is also a largely unknown area. So usually we are happy with the crystals we get And crystal engineering had been proceeding on this basis for many years, even decades. But now you see what's happened is we want more crystal structures. Ironically, at a time like this, when the Cambridge database has more than a million, million crystal structures, we still want more, because the whole idea of exploring crystal structure landscapes, and we talked about crystal structure prediction. So many theoretical structures are predicted but not realized in practice. They may be there, those things may be there, but maybe those crystals are too small, maybe they are nanocrystals. And in this era of high throughput crystallography, I think we need to sample more structural space. I think there is an acute need for something like this. And so crystals that don't look so good, we may want to look at many more of them. And plus, there are many things that do come out very poorly, because the molecules are inherently like that, or otherwise the way in which chemists make them. You may have a very pure compound chemically, and then which is obtained by, say, stripping a solvent off in a rotovap, and then you get some stuff, stuck on the side of the flask. That is, many times that is plenty crystalline, but it's nanocrystal. So nobody is going to be able to pull a crystal out of that, which you can stick on an X-ray diffractometer. But it's there, and we don't know how many crystal forms are there. There could be many. And so some of these, for example, data points which you get in a crystal structure prediction analysis, many of them may even be real structures which we simply have not been able to look at carefully enough. And then, there are, I think, I'll go a step further and stick my neck out. Many of the interesting problems in structural chemistry, especially with dynamics, could have to do with poorly shaped crystals, very small crystals. A very big area of crystal engineering now is the mechanical property of a crystal. So that, you have a crystal, say, like this, and then some crystals you're able to bend like this. Sometimes plastic bending, it stays like that. Sometimes elastic, it goes back. And so in the distorted regions of the crystal, what is the structure? And if you look at large samples, then of course, it's not periodic anymore. But if you make the sample size smaller and smaller and smaller, at some point in time, it does become periodic. So it is crystalline in very small areas. And there are people now in India and also outside who've started looking at crystal structures of these microdomains using synchrotron radiation. But with electron diffraction, of course, you can get even smaller, even smaller things. So, for example, if you take a crystal that is subject to elastic strain, in the same experiment, you may be able to monitor the crystal structures at different points of this bent crystal. Yes, it's not. This is not. This is well conceivable using today's know-how. And I feel this is one branch of crystal engineering. People talk about pharma a lot, and I hope we have some time to discuss pharma. But I think mechanical properties of crystals is something where an ability to sample nano-sized crystals will be really, it'll be a big breakthrough, actually. A big breakthrough.
Yeah, that describes already nicely the potential of electron diffraction in crystallography. One application indeed also is pharma. We think an important application. You wanted to speak more general in pharma, or
yes. Because well, in pharma, I think ED is going to be important for a couple of reasons. First, you want to know whether a polymorph exists. And right now it is a painful and laborious process where compound of interest, you do exhaustive crystallizations. But most of these crystallizations are under conditions of equilibrium or near equilibrium. So you're only likely to sample a few of the structures, potential structures. A typical way in which pharmaceutical chemists, medicinal chemists, people in the plant make crystals is, they take API, an active pharmaceutical ingredient, and it is usually dissolved in some organic solvent at some temperature, 45, 50, 60. And then when it is at that temperature, then a second non-solvent is added, which say rapid stirring. Now they do all this so that they get particles of uniform size. But in the process, you end up with crystal forms where the crystals are very small, microcrystalline and basically nano even. So you get very finely divided things, all crystalline, all amenable to, therefore, to electron diffraction methods. I mean, ED, you have seen a paper recently where somebody was even able to look at a tablet and take a crystal structure from that. I think one of your collaborators or something. Very nice paper. So in the industrial setting, the way in which APIs are actually purified could result in polymorphs which you are not able to get by, say, just putting it quietly into ethanol and in a conical flask and leaving it for 3 days. So the form you get over there in that condition may actually be very atypical. It may not represent the condition in the plant. And so the crystal that you're examining with electron diffraction may actually be much more relevant to the subject in hand, namely the polymorphism or the infringement of a patent or whatever it is, than the crystal that is obtained under somewhat artificial conditions that we like to do today, that we are constrained to use today, simply because of the huge size required for an X-ray diffraction experiment for the crystal. So I think the polymorphs obtained may be more relevant. You may get more polymorphs and be able to protect your, the intellectual property much faster. And I think, if nothing else, I think the legal community is going to be looking at electron diffraction very closely, because even today, the single crystal X-ray description, analysis and description of a crystal structure is usually taken by the courts as an unequivocal description of the structure. So for example, many of these lawsuits today have to do whether something is a hydrate or something is a stoichiometric hydrate or a non-stoichiometric hydrate, whether it's a sesquihydrate or a monohydrate, and so on and so on. And there are many blurry gray areas in this subject if you restrict yourself to X-ray diffraction. Now, if you are able to look at small samples with ED, then you may get a much better idea about what exactly you're talking about, because finally the ED also gives a picture of the structure in terms of the atoms. Atoms joined with lines, so there is no confusion as to how much, say, water there is or ethanol there is in that crystal. And I suspect in the end, even with progress in electron diffraction, I don't know whether one can look at disordered structures so easily with ED, but probably you could tell me more about that. But probably you could, and in that case that would further increase. So I would think some of the legal aspects could be taken care of better, the regulatory aspects could be taken care of better, and you will simply have a lot more data, good data, on the structural aspects of these pharmaceutical compounds. And quite obviously, I mean, even in terms of an innovator company, if he's able to take the tablet of the generic and show that his polymorph is there, I mean, the limit of detection comes down quite a bit, and I think many generics would be quite nervous with this technique.
So it's time we talk to Roland Beuze, huh? Well,
I know. I'm sure he has a lot more interesting stories already up his sleeve.
Yeah. Joel Bernstein is not around anymore.
I know. One misses him at times like this. Yeah.
But
I mean, we were talking about the early days. I remember. I can recount an incident. You may or may not use this for the interview, but both of us were very young, and this was in Erice, and we were listening to a lecture given by the late George Jeffrey, who was an international expert on hydrogen bonding. And So Jeffrey starts off his lecture and says that, if you had a way of measuring only the phases and not the intensities, you could solve all crystal structures. And so then I look at Joel and says, I say, Joel, this guy is so smart. How is it that I never thought of something like this? So then Joel just winks and smiles at me and says, don't worry, Gautam, by the time you're his age, you'll be saying things smarter than that.
Yeah.
So he was a great guy, and I really miss him. And some seminal original contributions to polymorphism and so on.
Yeah, yeah.
Really,
yeah. Yeah. Talking about history, what was the first time that you were introduced to electron diffraction techniques? Can't be that long ago.
Well, I think I'm like many other people. I think I did not know much about this technique until we heard about the Shechtman's work on the tenfold, fivefold symmetry and quasi-crystals.
Yeah.
I think that was the first time we knew that the power of electron diffraction. Although there had been other related things in physical metallurgy like field ion microscopy and things like that. But the fact that this was a powerful technique, and it was, in this case, I think ED could solve the problem because the method does not lend itself to X-ray diffraction. And you can't image these things using X-ray diffraction. So I think for many of us, I think this was the first time we were exposed to ED as such. And, the quick way in which IUCR responded and then changed its definition of the crystal, I think all these had a big impact on me.
Yeah. That was an interesting result. These quasi-crystals, this tenfold symmetry, and the fact that there was no obvious translational symmetry in the crystal anymore. Although none of the true crystallographic laws require a continuous periodicity.
Absolutely.
I always wondered, because there is, even in a quasi-crystal, you have vectors, all similar vectors all through space, and that makes kind of periodicity, or that explains at least diffraction if you have
yes, absolutely.
Similar
and in fact, I think in IUCR we were always happy that the union recognized the importance of this long before the Nobel Committee did. So it took them almost 30 years to appreciate the fundamental importance of something like this. Yeah,
but then it was really difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Especially with people like Linus Pauling and so on the scene.
That's
right. Some of Pauling's students had given me enough problems with weak hydrogen bonding. So I mean, so we know what it means when, in science. But I think it's better that way. I mean, when people are espousing radically new ideas, it is better that the opposition is also quite strong, because only if you can go through that strong opposition, then an idea will really be established, and it becomes the new thing of the future. And the only thing one hopes for is that the people who have propounded the new idea are not too harsh on newer ideas that come out in future. Because it's a continuing process, this science business. And there is no first word and there is no last word.
You know better than probably anybody else that the mother of all innovations is in material properties, and these obviously are largely defined by the atomic structure, and that again is the unique field of interest for crystal engineering, respectively crystallography. Is the discipline prepared to deliver the necessary information to contribute to economic and societal welfare to the required extent?
Absolutely, yes. If you take the big problems of today, climate, water, health, sanitation,
Mm-hmm.
All these things, the direct link between these big areas and functional crystals is already being demonstrated. The metal organic framework compounds and more recently the covalent organic frameworks
Yeah.
have big potential in catalysis, gas storage and delivery. I think this business of the mechanically pliable crystals, their use in sensors, photosalience, thermosalience, jumping crystals,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. Solid state reactions,
Mm-hmm.
where even crystallography, I mean, the original union of chemistry and crystallography in the hands of Gerhard Schmidt, who gave us the word crystal engineering itself, had to do with solid state reactions, and they can be very important in today's green chemistry scenario. So I would think in all the major issues of facing the day, I think functional crystals are going to have a bigger and bigger role to play. And if you make a hybrid of organic, inorganic, and inorganic, materials of a molecular type,
Mm-hmm.
then I think the canvas is potentially very vast, which is why I said our earlier comments on artificial intelligence. That's why I feel this will become important, because the number of, something like which we have used now for 30, 40, 50 years, like the Cambridge Structural Database, already that is becoming sort of inadequate to develop the complexity of some of the new structures that are coming out. Then what happens? With electron diffraction, you're going to be able to look at samples that are not wholly crystalline.
Mm-hmm.
But because you can look at smaller and smaller things. Now look at it this way. Suppose you have 2 unit cells, which are slightly different from each other, and you can monitor them with ED. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Then if you look at them with, say, XRD, it's going to look, say, amorphous, or it's going to look something else. So the limits of resolution are changing all the time, getting better and better. So our description of less ordered and disordered and even amorphous. Now, biggest challenge is how to look at amorphous things. Coming back to pharma, the amorphous drugs are highly soluble in most cases. And so there is an obvious bioavailability advantage in marketing an amorphous drug. The problem with an amorphous drug, of course, is it becomes crystalline, because it's not the best, it's the most happiest condition and to be in. So the question is, can you, degrees of amorphicity, for example, can ED be used to probe things like this? So I would feel that it's basically a very, very big canvas. I would give anything to be, say, a 30-year-old chemist starting his career today in crystal engineering. That's right.
Yeah. Energy storage is one of those fields.
Absolutely. Methane, carbon dioxide, separations, energy storage. Absolutely. I think we've not seen the last of these new types of batteries, which may be based on MOFs and things like that. Big future, Eric, big future.
Energy in general, making gasoline out of CO2, things like that.
Correct. Because at least by 2030, most people say we will be off, fossil fuels in big ways. So we all have to be prepared for that, and our science also has to be geared in some of these directions, which means an overall strategic design of where science should go by governments, not strictly leaving it in the hands of, blue sky amateurs like myself who just do what we like to do. But, there should be maybe more coordinated activities and efforts, by governments and things like that. I think in such a scenario, I would feel that new and advanced instrumentation, new techniques, such as the one we are talking about today, ED and so many others, I think they will play a big, big role.
Right. Yeah. Nice to hear. Yeah. With your professional career and your tenure at IUCR, you have overseen many trends and patterns in the recent history of crystallography. How would you see the future of crystallography?
Very, very bright, because crystallography is a subject that is not scared to redefine itself. The crystallographic community, which you have observed and almost been a part of. I mean, although you are not a practicing academic researcher, you have seen so many of us, and over so many years that you are part of the community, okay? And you would notice that we are all generally very broad-minded. We are not likely to stick to the same thing in some sort of orthodox way. I mean, today cryo-EM, which is very closely related to ED, has become a part of crystallography, although we all know that there is no diffraction going on in cryo-EM. But still, it's called crystallography. Crystallography means crystal. Crystal means diffraction. So then, what is cryo-EM doing in the subject of crystallography? But it is, and crystallographers don't see any contradiction in this. You know, so I feel that in my years in IUCR and as a practicing crystallographer of 40+ years, a very broad observation I could make is that this subject alternates between periods where methods and techniques develop. Methods and techniques develop up to a certain level, and then the applications using those methods and techniques then follow. And I have seen this thing alternating. So whether it's your instrumentation, whether it's your technique, whether it is again in diffraction, spectroscopy or computation, there is a period of intense development of methods and techniques and instruments. And then you hand these over to people like us who use them. And then we start churning things out. And then we come to a point where we come and tell you, look, we can go this far, but no further. And then you people go ahead and develop the next lot of techniques. So I have seen crystallography more or less developing like this, actually in all branches of the subject, whether, yes, up and down. And whether it's physics related, chemistry related, or biology related, I have seen the same thing happening, and it doesn't matter whether it's diffraction, spectroscopy, or computation. This happens in all these three. And because suddenly what happens with the new instruments or the new computation or the new computers, what was very difficult suddenly becomes very easy. And so this is why crystallographers always want to rediscover themselves. Now, I can tell you a personal anecdote which people like me, say Joel Bernstein, Dario Braga, and people of my generation, when we did our PhDs, these were all typically in the early to mid to late 1970s, determining a crystal structure was extremely difficult as well. You know, my thesis consisted of 4 crystal structures, of which 2 were not really correct, because they had some severe form of disorder, which we knew it was disordered, but we just left the structure where it was. It was not possible to look at it in further detail. And this took me, as I said, the crystallographic part of my thesis took about 1.5 years. And so 4 structures in 18 months, you know, something like that. And that was considered a very big number. And then towards the end of my stay, I saw this first computer-controlled machine from a company called Syntex. I don't know, Syntex became called something else afterwards, I think.
Nicolay,
Nicolay, that's right. And then it looked very smart compared to our bulky machines that we were used to working with. It looked very smart and nice, all bright colors and so on, with a nice, you know, case that covered it and stuff. And so, said 2 days. 2 days, the whole structure comes out. If it was especially P21 by C or something like that, it was no question. You just punch some buttons and you got the structure. So suddenly, the expertise that we had developed in analyzing these higher level Weissenberg photographs suddenly became redundant. I mean, so many of us were looking around to rediscover ourselves. There was going to be no future in simply determining crystal structures for chemists.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the subjects of chemistry and crystallography were themselves a bit separate. So when a chemist couldn't get a structure with NMR, he'd approach a crystallographer and say, look, I'm not able to find out exactly the ring junction in this complicated, say, sesquiterpene or something. Can you help me? And so then crystallography got the answer. So they would come and they would say, oh, that's fine. And generally and somewhat uncharitably, they would say sometimes, oh, this is the structure. Oh, yeah, actually the NMR did show something like this. You know? Yeah. They would say that.
Yeah.
They would say that. Yeah, you know. And so gradually what happened was that we realized that just determining crystal structures was not the answer. We would be rapidly out of date. And so the idea, it occurred to me, I guess, one of the earliest, which is why I guess my name is associated with crystal engineering more than some others, is that if you look at groups of structures, then some patterns one might start beginning to emerge. You may start seeing some patterns across groups of structures. And these patterns would be repeating and what we call later robust. So that these robust patterns could then be brought back to design new molecules which gave you the same crystal structure. So the question of many different molecules giving essentially the same type of crystal structure, this started getting embedded in the minds of structural chemists. And that's how the subject of crystal engineering itself began. So our subject depends on, always has depended on getting a large number of crystal structures. This is why I'm excited about ED, because I see suddenly the number of potential structures that will become available, I think will suddenly, it's going to start expanding. That's what I predict.
Yeah. Well, I just realized that I was a bit in crystal engineering as well, working on intermetallic phases with Partey in Geneva. We also had very reproducible building blocks, and we try to do a little bit of prediction also on
correct
having these trigonal prisms arrange themselves in smaller and larger blocks and octagonal. Yeah,
I mean, look at it, Eric, in a simplistic way. If something repeats itself, then nature likes it. There is something good about that fact.
Yeah, this the syntax machine you mentioned, that was the work of Bob Sparks and Harold Christensen and Sue Byram. Yeah. And then it ended up in Nicolay, and Nicolay became Siemens. So also a long story. Yeah.
Correct. 1975 was when I first looked at that machine.
Yeah. Early 70s, I think Syntax started. Also almost as a garage company. Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned something like it would be great to be a crystallographer these days, a young crystallographer these days. Sorry, you are of course, but being young again, what would be your advice for young researchers in crystallography today?
First, look carefully at what's going on around you. Don't start your research career. If I take your question to mean that a young person starting, a young man or a young woman starting in crystallography, before you start choosing an area or something, because this is a major investment, first look around you. See what's happening. Don't worry too much about what you studied in your PhD and postdoc years. Listen to crazy people saying crazy things.
Yeah.
There will be many of these crazy things are really crazy. You can forget about them, but something somewhere, try to see if you can identify a gap somewhere. So something has happened, some understanding was imperfect. People have brushed something aside and pushed it under the rug, claiming that it is too difficult, or sometimes, oh, it's not very important. That kind of thing. If you find something like that, find something where there is a gap. I remember myself the first, I would say, major conference that I attended in something that could be considered as leading to crystal engineering in the future was this ICOS meeting. I think you probably came to the ICOS meeting in Bangalore in 2010 or 2011, was it?
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
Yeah. So the second ICOS or third ICOS meeting was held in Brandeis University in 1978. 78. Yes, and it was the first, and there were 4 or 5 very important people. It was called Organic Solid State Chemistry. I think that conference is still called Chemistry of the Organic Solid State or something. Although the title looks vaguely, non-fashionable today, but then it was very fashionable. So there were 3 or 4 or 5 experts, world experts in the area, and they all gave these scholarly talks, and we were all listening in hushed silence and so on. But at the end of each talk, they kept saying the same thing. These reactions are very interesting, but if we only knew how to control these crystal structures, only then we would get a control on the reaction. And it was not one of them who said that, but all of them. These included people like my own supervisor, David Curtin, Mendel Cohen, who was, of course, Gerhard Schmidt's assistant and close associate, John Thomas, who was still in Wales before he passed away recently last year, and then Gerhard Wegner, he was then in Freiburg before he moved to Mainz, and they were all the polydiacetylene man. So all of them said the same thing. We don't know how to control, forget about prediction. They even mentioned that that's a hopeless goal for the future. But we don't have anything more than some empirical guidelines. How on earth do these structures arrange themselves? How do molecules arrange themselves? So if 3, 4, 5 people say the same thing, and this is something I've always observed in science. If one person says something, you can dismiss it as cranky or something like that. But if more than 2, 3 people start saying it, then it's not a coincidence. Then it is a big problem that is faced by many people. And the other advantage was that when you work in these gap areas, there is nobody else. And this is wonderful.
Yeah.
Because you are so unimportant that nobody cares what you're doing even. And that was the time when I was returning to India. Unlike many people who got their PhDs in India and went and settled down in America, I got my PhD in America and then came and settled down in India. So I was doing the reverse journey. And in a place like that, you've been to India so many times. So there are even now places which look isolated. And so there is a physical isolation, there is a scientific isolation, no email, of course, no telephones even in the place where I was working for the first 10 years. And no nothing, basically. So I always call it, the freedom of the beggar. He can do whatever he wants and nobody even cares. And when you're working on some idea, it's very nice when nobody even cares in the beginning, because you can start developing some ideas, some of which will be crazy, but some of which may actually click, and that's what really happened in my case. So I would say having a PhD with a good man and or a good a woman, and having a nice postdoctoral position with a well-known scientist or a productive scientist is important, but you shouldn't let the shadow of that person guide your own research. I think this is something that it kills originality. And of course, another advantage in my case was I never had a postdoctoral stint. I didn't do a postdoc at all. So I had only one mentor. And he was a person who was a very laid-back supervisor, David Curtin. And so he wouldn't interfere much. I was one of his last students also. And he didn't interfere much. And above all, the only thing he told me when going back to India was that don't do things that look similar to what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was very good advice. And that's the sort of advice I would, since you use that word, what I would give to young people. I've given that to all my students, some of whom are doing exceedingly well today, as you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You are still connected to IISc, I understand?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, yeah, I am what is called an honorary professor, which means I'm able to maintain my labs and I can take postdocs.
Okay.
But I cannot take graduate students, and obviously I don't have teaching responsibilities and I, that kind of thing. So it gives a nice soft interim period between being fully in service and being fully retired.
Yeah.
And you know better, many scientists, people like us, we cannot stop thinking about science.
Yeah.
And so this sort of a thing gives but I'm still associated with journals like JACS and Gavente and so on their editorial boards. So all this keeps me quite busy, and I also get to know what's happening in many cases. I also write a few papers every year.
Yeah.
It's not that it's not come down to a very small number, but not, of course, like the kind of thing I was doing when I had a large research group. But I'm happy because I've had my day and I've been able to say several things that other people listen to seriously.
Yeah, and today again. Yeah. Yeah.
It's been a great pleasure, Eric, actually talking to you, because someone whom I know so well over so many years, and you too have changed into gone from X-ray diffraction to electron, so a nice jump. So I think
I'm very happy with it. New wins, new adventure, really, new technology. Okay. Well, not completely new, of course, but it's getting a lot more recognition now. It's more in the focus, and
no, it's very much in the focus. Very much in the focus. I mean, the other day I had given a seminar somewhere, I gave a talk, and then I mentioned ED actually, and I said that this is something that's going to come up quite big. I mean, you had this other crystalline sponge technique to look at molecular structures, but I think compared to that, I think ED has got several advantages, although that is a very elegant technique also in itself.
Yeah, and it was really curious that no dedicated instrumentation was around. Sure, you can do nice things with electron microscopes, but they're very expensive. It's still a hassle, and so yeah.
I mean, I'm so thrilled to know that you've got actually a tabletop machine now, and this is going to really bring it. You have to bring it down to the common people. And electron diffraction, you see, you can keep it in a pharma factory.
Yeah.
You don't have to put it in a nice research lab where they're publishing papers in JACS and Gavente. It can go into a factory where they're actually able to sample the things that are coming off these big crystallization batches, and they can tell you if it is polymorphically pure, and which is so important in that business. So it's right there. It's right there.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. It was a great honor and a pleasure.
Most welcome, Eric, and I wish you and all the others in LDCO all success.